Welcome to the Paper Boats podcast. My name's Ian Grosz. I'm a researcher and writer, and like many people, I'm concerned about our deepening environmental crises. In each episode of this podcast, I'll be meeting with a different writer from the Paper Boats collective. We'll discuss their work and the issues that they write about. Paper Boats are a group of writers from across Scotland and beyond, inspired by Kathleen Jamie's poetic response to COP26. They're working together to highlight the impacts of climate change, the ecological collapse we are witness to, and the things we can do to help bring about positive change. If you're concerned about climate change, want to delve further into the issues surrounding it, and like great writing, follow and subscribe to the Paper Boats podcast to hear from a host of fantastic nature writers. Hello, and thanks for choosing to listen to this episode of the Paper Boats podcast. Joining me remotely today from the opposite side of the Cairngorms to Aberdeen is author, playwright, columnist and community storyteller Merryn Glover. Merryn was born in Kathmandu to Australian parents and grew up in Nepal, India and Pakistan. She studied English and drama in Australia and settled in Scotland after travelling around the world and meeting her husband, Alistair. She was the first writer in residence for the Cairngorms National Park in 2019, co-hosts the Cairngorms-based Storyland Sessions with musician Hamish Napier, and is a regular Guardian Country Diary columnist. Merryn's books include A House Called Askeval, a novel spanning 70 years of one family living in a Himalayan hill station, first published in 2014 by Freight Books and released in audiobook format in 2024. Of Stone and Sky is a novel set in the Cairngorms exploring the history and landscape of a community, which was longlisted for the Highland Book Prize in 2021 and awarded Book of the Year by the Bookmark Book Festival. And her most recent, The Hidden Fires, a Cairngorms Journey with Nan Shepherd, published by Polygon and shortlisted for the Boardman Tasker Award for Mountain Literature in 2023. So welcome, Merryn. Thanks so much for joining us. I know you're pretty busy. You were at an online event yesterday, and tomorrow you're hosting a panel discussion with Kerry Andrews. So I'm very glad you managed to squeeze this in between.
Oh, thanks very much for having me, Ian. It's really great to be on this podcast.
It's good to have you on. So I think it's fair to say, just going from your background, that you had an unusual upbringing, really, compared to many people, and to me it seems quite exciting and adventurous. And having settled in the Cairngorms, it's little wonder that your writing features mountain environments, mountain literature. But I wondered if, for listeners, you could take us back to that early experience growing up in those different countries, that environment, and what that's done for your outlook on the world and how it might have shaped you, perhaps as a writer.
Yeah, thank you. I think like every child, when you're growing up, you don't reflect on it. It's just your experience. You don't think it's unusual in any way. But I guess the more that I have grown up, the more I realise it was unusual, and I think incredibly privileged. My parents never really had two pennies to rub together, but it was, in every other sense of the word, a really rich upbringing. So I spent quite a lot of my very early childhood in a village in Nepal, in the foothills of the Himalayas, amongst the Gurung community. And when I was 9, went to school in North India, in the hill station where A House Called Askeval is set. My parents also worked in Pakistan for 5 years towards the end of my school life, so I also spent time there. So those 3 countries in South Asia are sort of indelibly burned into my early memories. I went back to both India and Nepal to work, most often to Nepal. So sort of Nepal is where it all began and the place I've probably returned to most out of all of those. And I just have a very deep and abiding love for that part of the world and its many peoples and ethnicities and languages and its cultural richness. And I've felt incredibly enriched by that. And so my writing is very responsive to place. I'm very interested in themes of belonging and identity and culture and what it might mean to be moving through different kinds of places and cultures and identities, how we get a sense of who we are. and the physical place is a really important part of that, that the natural world, particularly mountains, an abiding love for mountains. And I'm fascinated by the differences between people like myself who have moved so many times and people who have a very deeply rooted life experience. And I guess a lot of the people around me here in the Cairngorms, particularly land-based workers, often have had generations in the one place. And I'm just really interested by the different relationships with place that will emerge from those very different ways of living.
So you settled in the Cairngorms with your husband, who first introduced you to the Highlands, the Scottish Highlands. Is that when your writing career began? Would you say once you settled, and was it partly that looking back to these other places? Is that, had the writing begun, the serious writing, your career that begun earlier?
Well, yeah, I guess as with most writers, it's something that you do from a very young age in a variety of different ways. And my original qualification, a teaching degree in English drama dance, we did a lot of devising of theatre productions from, off the cuff improvisations to sort of full scale productions. And so there was a kind of writing element in that. And so my first major work actually was a stage play. That was after I'd moved to Scotland, but I was living in Stirling at the time rather than up here in the Cairngorms. And I'd been doing quite a lot of work in sort of reminiscence and life story work with elderly people with dementia. And this play was called The Long Way Home and was about a woman with dementia and her younger sister who cares for her, just a two-hander play. And it was initially a stage play across three theatres in central Scotland and then was adapted for Radio Scotland. Then my husband and I went back to work in Nepal. He was working in a major hospital in Kathmandu, and I was teaching in a small international school.
Right.
So I was at the time gathering lots of notes and fragments, but I was very, very busy as a teacher. So little bits of poetry emerging here and there, and a strong sense that I knew I wanted to capture something of this Nepal experience in writing, but I wasn't quite sure what form that would take. And it wasn't until we got back to Stirling, and at that point I had a 2-year-old and a baby, and life was, of course, incredibly busy and intense. But then I found a leaflet from the Scottish Arts Council, as it was then, about new writers' bursaries, as they were then called. And I applied and received this bursary. And I do remember the moment of getting that letter, and that felt like, oh, I am a real writer.
Yeah, what a turning
Um,
point.
and that was to write a series of short stories set in Nepal. So I did go on to in the course of that year to write about 12 stories. Really, just the interesting thing was I was no longer in Nepal, but I had all these folders of notes and clippings and all kinds of and photographs, of course, from the time that I was there, and I knew I was going to want to write about it, but I wasn't sure how. So then I wrote these 12 short stories, and some of them were in anthologies and collections, won competitions in on Radio 4. Um, so so there was that. And then during that process, went on a radio drama lab that was run jointly by BBC Radio Scotland and the Scottish Book Trust. And from out of that experience, I went on to write, I think, another 3 or 4 radio plays for both Radio Scotland and Radio 4.
Fantastic.
So the first one was written as a stage play, and then somebody else adapted it for radio. So this was the first time I'd written directly for radio. And I absolutely loved that process. I mean, it was a really difficult process, learning to write for radio. Quite hard work. So I think I don't know how many scripts I actually wrote. It was I think 4 that were broadcast. But I love like podcasts. I love radio. I've always loved that sense of just listening. I listen to podcasts and radio much, much more than I watch television. I don't watch television much. Also a great medium, but I'm very influenced by what I hear. Partly why I wanted to bring out the audiobook of A House Called Askeval this year. And I think it's a primal thing going back to when we had stories read to us as children, reading to my own children. There's some very special kind of intimacy about the voice and just the voice, and all of the images are in your head. As they say, radio does the best pictures. So I loved that process of writing radio drama. And it was somewhere through that sort of process of writing radio plays that I then started to write the first novel. And that I started that when we were living in Stirling, and then finished that once we moved up here to the Cairngorms. So again, it was a kind of strange thing that I was writing about India when I was no longer there.
Hmm.
And I wonder if it was a way of actually wanting to hold on to or return to these places that were very precious to me, and these people and these experiences, so that I didn't lose them. And I didn't lose the stories that inhabited me. I needed to give them shape and get them out of me and put them on a page. And then the very interesting thing was, after moving here, Of Stone and Sky was the first kind of major piece of work that was very much about the place I was living in at the time. Um, and that seemed to be about, I'd been living here for 7 years when I started it. And it seemed to be a way of doing a real deep dive into this place, having kind of observed and listened and learned to live here, but wanting to unearth its stories and find a story that was somehow really pulling on me, that literally came to me in the middle of the night and woke me up and made me think, yeah, what does it mean to be somebody very rooted, very hefted to the hill, if you like, because it's the story of a shepherd, and what the relationship with place is. Because it's a very interesting place here. You do get those people who have been born and bred here and generations of living here. But because it's kind of in the national park, and it's on the A9, and it's very accessible to Edinburgh and Inverness, you get a lot of people like me that have come from other parts of the world, and it's a real mix socially. So I found that fascinating, and that was also part of what I was interested to explore in that novel.
I think it's
Um,
fascinating because it's an approach to landscape that's very much bound up with the life ways of the people that are in it. And it's a very anthropological approach.
yeah, and that was one of the things that I found really interesting and really drove me through the novel was, here is an extraordinary landscape, and it's why it's been designated a national park. It is beautiful, it is precious, it's vulnerable, but it's a very peopled landscape and has been for thousands of years. And although when you're right up in the Cairngorm Mountains, it can feel like wilderness and it can feel like thousands of miles from anywhere, the reality is every inch of it has been traversed by people in some way, or sheep or
Hmm.
Highland cattle. One of the drove roads drove right through the Cairngorms, at one time. And there's been lots of different ways of life lived out across these mountains, and a long history of human relationship with this landscape and human shaping of this landscape for better and worse. And so very strong vested interests in what the land is for, how it should be used or not used, what it means to be a vibrant landscape, the tensions around leaving it free of people, to allow nature regeneration, but then the fact that there's been a lot of loss of people in these landscapes. There's entire glens here that used to have, Glen Bannecher beyond Newton Moor, that used to probably have about 300 people at a time before the A9, when the main route up north was around Glen Bannecher, around the back of Craigdhu above Newton Moor. And now it's like bleak and it's empty, and there's hardly anyone that lives there anymore. So I was really interested to explore all the complexity of the different ways in which different kinds of people relate to this landscape, and what that means for the land and what that means for the people, what that history has been, what the contemporary issues are, and what might actually be a hopeful future for both land and people,
Hmm.
and how we have the power to heal one another through it.
It seems very linked with your involvement with the Storyland Sessions, that sentiment that you just expressed.
Mm.
Can you talk about that and how you became involved with it and what the focus of that is, that project?
Yeah, I love to. So the Storyland Sessions is a community project that is bringing together music, storytelling, song, poetry. There's been some dance, quite a lot of imagery, some film as well. and getting the people together, typically once a month for a kind of community show, a sharing really, where everybody in the community is welcome to contribute something. And my colleague Hamish Napier, who's Scottish traditional folk musician, he runs folk music workshops, and on another night of the month, I run creative writing, spoken word workshops. So there's all those different ways in which people engage, and then once a year a celebratory ceilidh as well, which, like a more traditional ceilidh, some of the time is dancing, but a lot of the time is also people sharing songs and stories and so on. And in terms of what is actually shared on those nights, it is very much rooted in the tradition, the history, the heritage of this area. And with Hamish as a born and bred local from Strathspey and a folk musician, and we have lots of wonderful contribution from Gaelic speakers, the Beidnach Walking Group, who are a group of women that do that wonderful traditional Gaelic singing whilst working the Tweed, and the songs from particularly from the Outer Hebrides. We're very, very blessed that we have them in our community and they come and share with us. We also have like Gaelic scholars like Seamus Grant, who comes and gives us the context of a song and then just sings a cappella. And honestly, the hairs stand up on my skin when he sings, because you feel you are hearing a voice out of the distant past, but it's resonating and reverberating down these hundreds of years to us in this present time. And it's the most extraordinary sense of a people and in a place.
It sounds
So there
wonderful.
is that rootedness, but it's very much about saying this is who we are in the here and now, and we acknowledge and we're really interested in what we've come from and what this place has been. But this is a place of people that have traveled. If you think about it, of course, everybody came at one point, as the ice retreated, people started to come, across from Europe to come and go, and then eventually to settle. And then we've had waves of different kinds of settlement and departure, the enormous losses from the area in the clearances and the famines and emigration. And then new waves of people
Yeah,
coming.
it's a never-ending story, that particular.
Exactly. And that is part of its richness. And, it's so beautiful that sometimes we will get somebody and they're singing a song in Gaelic, but it was written in Canada. And things like that. It's kind of bringing things all back home and saying to people, whoever you are and whatever your story is, you are welcome here. You are part of what makes this place and this night special and unique, and we love to hear your story. So we've had Indian storytellers, and we have a young teenage girl from Ukraine who comes to sing because she's now part of our community, and we've had an African who's walked in off the street because he was here for a conference on agriculture, and he's like, this thing's happening. This is amazing, So, and we just love that. And we love the fact that it's not your packaged shortbread tin Scottish Highland experience. It's a real Highland experience. So yes, you will get some tartan if that's what people feel like wearing, and we've got some fantastic pipers and clarsach players. We invented a collective noun when you have a whole host of clarsachs together, and that is a happiness of harps, because
I like that.
we had 7 of them lined up together. So it absolutely celebrates all of what is traditional Scottish Highland culture, but very much in the contemporary, in the here and now, and the real people who call this home.
It sounds wonderful, but I want to come back now to your most recent book, The Hidden Fires, and you're going to read for us from that work. And before you do, I just wondered if you would mind telling us a bit about how the book came about, and perhaps set the scene for the reading for us.
Sure. Yeah, so in 2019, I had this wonderful opportunity to be writer in residence for the Cairngorms National Park. And it was a project called Shared Stories, A Year in the Cairngorms. And it took me right across the park, which is quite something because you've got to kind of go over the mountain to the D side of it and back to the space side, over the snow roads. And it just meant I met an incredible range of people, from school kids to grizzled old land-based workers and farmers and keepers, and rangers, health walk groups, tourists, the rest of it, and offering workshops to people, really giving them the opportunities to capture in words their own feelings about the nature of the park. And with that recognition that we need nature to be in good shape in order for us to thrive. And if nature is going to be in good shape, we need to look after it. And so there's this incredibly important relationship there. So that was the focus of the project. And it was whilst I was in the middle of that year of residency that Jamie Crawford from Berlin, the publisher, approached me to say, would you consider writing a response to Nan Shepherd's The Living Mountain, a book which I obviously already knew and loved. And it was quite a daunting prospect, but also just really exciting to be given the opportunity to do that. I don't think I ever would have had the audacity to attempt it off my own bat, but here was this invitation to sort of submit a proposal and sample chapters. So, but part of what was liberating about that invitation was the recognition that there was no point trying to write a copycat version of her book. It's such a beautiful book. It can't be bettered. There's no point trying to do the same thing. And it would very much need to be a different story, a different take on the mountains, a conversation with her from a different voice. So, and they were just really interested in the experience of a contemporary woman living, walking, writing in the Cairngorms today, and the sort of contrasts with Shepherd and her experiences, but also the places of intersection, of coming together, of being of one mind, the places where we diverted as well. So it was an extraordinary opportunity to really delve not just into a landscape, but into the way in which one woman has engaged with it and how that might resonate with and enrich my own experience of it.
So you're going to read for us now. I just wondered if you'd be able to just quickly set up this particular passage that you're going to read.
Yes, so in this passage, this is part of the chapter called The Plateau, which is this big, wide, sweeping expanse that you get at the top of the Cairngorms. And it was a walk that my husband Alistair and I had done where we were camping out up there for a couple of nights. And one of the lovely things about the Cairngorms is the people that you meet. So that's who we talk about at the start there with the Porridge family. But also in this passage, I refer to a place being thin. And that term, talking about a thin place, is it's got quite an old Celtic idea of places where the sense of the membrane between earth and heaven is very thin. The sense that the spiritual is incredibly present to us in the physical, and that something is numinous. The beyond is very close, and the sacred is here in the substance of earth. So that's what's being referred to there when I talk about a thin space. We had a brew of coffee and a chat with the Porridge family, then set off south across the rock-tumbled terrain. Its lip yielded startling views down into Loch Wanya, one of the 4 green lochs of the Cairngorms. Not green that day. It was a deep, ringing indigo blue that softened to turquoise at the edges, where the water was so clear we could see the steep sides sloping down into unfathomable depths. Above us, the sky vaulted in echoing blue, holding together the sharp ridge lines, the glowing hills, the distant horizon. The ocean of cloud had slipped away from the nearby chasms, and its retreating tide eddied like surf in the valleys. At my feet, grasses like threads of gold were tousled in the breeze, and there was no sound but fleeting bird whistles and the rush of a burn. Perched on a rock high above the loch, I watched the sunlight spangling its surface and drew the world into me like breath. Writing of the mountain, Shepherd says, "The mind cannot carry away all that it has to give, nor does it always believe possible what it has carried away." No, indeed. The mind cannot even begin to receive it all, let alone retain or understand it. but in the act of trying, the self is enlarged. Beauty opens me. High mountain air stretches my lungs, far views flood my head, the whole wild presence of it expanding the whole of me till I become porous. It is not just the sacred space that is thin, but the person who sees it. Wonder pours into me and lifts me up like a lantern, floating and filled with light. Perhaps it is what Shepherd meant when she said, "One walks the flesh transparent."
It's a beautiful passage and beautifully illustrates what you were talking about, Merryn. And it feels to me the closing part of that passage is filled with an almost ecstatic, almost religious reverie. You know, a real sense of of nature as sacred, but also the communion between that sense of the sacred and your inner self, your spiritual side. I wondered if how much of that kind of thinking or that idea informs how you approach writing about nature and environment, and what your personal views on that are.
Yes, fundamentally, it's very essential to who I am and always have been in the spiritual life. I'm a Christian and I understand the world and experience the world very much as made by God and filled with the presence of God, and that I experience that presence very intimately when I'm in the natural world. And it makes my response to the natural world is I suppose a response of praise and worship to the Creator.
I guess a lot of people might think that people with traditional religious beliefs might sit above nature in some way. You know, the traditional biblical view of the earth and all its beasts. You know, being for us.
Yeah, I do totally understand that critique. And there is the opening part of Genesis and the creation story where God gives the garden to Adam and Eve and commands them to have kind of what might be understood as dominion over the earth, and it's often been translated in that way. But others would understand that passage to be that humanity has been given a particular intelligence, and therefore a level of responsibility to steward and look after the earth, the creation. And so I understand that there are objections to the idea of human exceptionalism, because it can imply that we somehow are superior beings, that everything else has been made for us to exploit and to extract from, and that is the whole reason that we've got into the mess that we're in at the moment. But we have moral responsibility in a way that nothing else in nature does. There is a higher demand upon us in terms of how we treat one another, and also then how we treat the earth. And so I think for me, that's my understanding of the Genesis passage. And I think for actually a lot of people of faith, that it is a commission to actually take care of the earth, not a command to lord it over the rest of creation, but to actually be a servant of it, to be a steward of it.
Yeah, I guess because of the sheer scale, potential scale and current scale of our agency, I think the key word is probably responsibility or moral responsibility. And you do say elsewhere that our existence is bound up with the fate of every other part and particle of the world. Our challenge is to live this truth.
Yeah, exactly. So it's definitely a mistake to think that as human beings we're somehow separate from nature. We are of nature. We're of the earth. And earlier in that passage, I talk about the fact that we belong here too, every bit as much as the eagle and the mountain azalea. And we are also driven by instincts, and our communities are precious as well. And our homes, we need homes, we need shelter, we need food, we need one another. But what's happened is we have taken far more than what we need, and we have damaged and almost irreparably destroyed not only what is our very own life system, but what I would say is the most extraordinary and beautiful gift of God. So to me, it is a desecration of the sacred in what we have done to the earth. And so to that extent, I think we do have a different place in it, or we do have a different capacity, a different moral culpability for what we've done and what we now need to do. I was quite struck by the words of Catherine Hayhoe, who's a very eminent climate scientist and is also a Christian. And she talked about the fact, she said, climate change isn't just an environmental issue, it's a threat multiplier. It takes the most serious humanitarian issues confronting us today: hunger, poverty, lack of access to clean water, injustice, refugee crises, and more, and it makes them worse. And so I think that's partly why it matters so profoundly, is it's not just about some three-toed slug somewhere that's maybe going extinct, or it's not just about not having enough trees, or things that some people might think only environmentalists care about. It's not about some fringe issue. It is about the vitality of human life on Earth and the life of the Earth in the fullness of that, nature as well as us. And of course, we are part of nature, but the more than human world as well as the human world, I guess, our shared life that is so at threat and is on the brink of an absolute collapse. And we desperately, deeply need to respond to that.
It's a very powerful message, Merryn. And it's clear from your writing that you've got just a wonderful sensitivity and empathy and awareness of the natural world and our place in it. And I just want to say thank you so much for a really fascinating insight into your writing and your life. It's been lovely to have you on. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me, Ian.
I heard the beautiful promises, and sure, I'm a river, but I can take a side. From this day I'd rather keep afloat like wee folded paper boats, the hopes of the young folk chanting at my bank, fear in their spring bright eyes. So hear this: fail them and I will rise.
Paper Boats supports Global Justice Now and the Scottish Rewilding Alliance. To learn more about their campaigns and Paper Boats writers, go to paperboats.org.